In our previous study of Hosea, we spent our time primarily in verse 1, just setting the stage for the time of this particular prophecy. We did note, of course, as the first phrase of verse 1 says, this is a word of the Lord, and you can't take away from that fact at all. This isn't something that was made up by some later redactor and back in time, inserting their theology back in Hosea's time. No, this is a prophecy of the Lord given to this particular man at a particular time in history. We spent most of the time talking about the time frame, of course, and mentioned several kings of Judah and a king of Israel that set the stage for this timeline. And it's solidly, of course, in the 8th century BC that we're talking about here. We come now to verse 2, Hosea chapter 1, verse 2. It says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take to yourself a wife of harlotry, have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. Of course, we're going to have a little bit of insight here into Hosea's family, and that's going to play a large role in the message that Hosea is sharing. This marriage that God is proposing to Hosea, to a woman named Gomer, we won't know her name till chapter 1, verse 3, but this marriage to Gomer and the naming of the children to that union were among the first public prophetic acts God asked of Hosea. It says when the Lord first spoke. So this is at the beginning, if you will, of his ministry. But it says, go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. Any serious study of the book of Hosea has to deal with what I'm going to call the Gomer problem or the Gomer issue. And that, of course, is just the identity and or profession of the wife mentioned here in chapter 1. Again, it has commanded much attention in the study of Hosea by scholars over the years. The main question, of course, is, was Gomer a harlot or a prostitute when Hosea married her? Well, you might say, well, that's what my Bible says, especially a lot of the newer translations go and say things like this. The Common English Bible says, go marry a prostitute. The Message paraphrase says, find a whore and marry her. The NIV translates it this way, go marry a promiscuous woman. And the New Living Translation says, go and marry a prostitute. And those translations basically make that decision for you, don't they? Well, it's obvious if you take it at face value. Well, she was a prostitute when Gomer married her. But the text literally says, and this is one of those times the New American Standard stays closer to what the text literally says. It literally says, take a wife of harlotry. Now, perhaps that means the same thing as go marry a prostitute in Hebrew, but it is odd language if the point you're trying to make is that the woman you are referring to is currently a harlot or prostitute. If someone is currently a practicing harlot, the Bible uses a related term, but states it differently. In places like Joshua chapter 6, verse 17, in connection with the taking of the city there and the work of Rahab, it says, the city shall be under the ban, and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. And that's the way, that the Hebrew refers to a practicing harlot. It just refers to her as the harlot. We see it in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 16, with the women who had the debate over the child with King Solomon. It says that then 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before them. So once again, the Hebrew has a way of referring to a practicing prostitute. They just refer to it as a harlot. So that's why when the Hebrew states it the way it does here in this verse, take a wife of harlotry, I think perhaps the difference in phrasing may be intentional. The phrase wife of harlotry may refer to someone who has those inclinations, not necessarily to someone in the midst of practicing it. If that was the intention, God could have easily said here in Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, to go take a harlot. Hosea uses similar language in other places in the book, and you will note, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, verse 1, verse 2 says, take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. That's another related phrase. But when we get to chapter 4 in Hosea, in verse 12, notice what it says there. My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them, for a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God. And you see the kind of the difference there. We could compare spirit of harlotry to a wife of harlotry, and here I think it's obvious that this spirit of harlotry was an inclination among the people toward this type of thing, but it says the spirit led them astray, and that when it led them astray, then they began practicing or playing the harlot. Then in chapter 5 and verse 4 of Hosea, it refers once again to this spirit of harlotry. It says their deeds will not allow them to return to their God, for a spirit of harlotry is within them, and they do not know the Lord. All right, so I think maybe that gives us a little insight into how Hosea is using the term when we come back to the phrase, take a wife of harlotry. Here's a quote from one Bible scholar named Stewart. He's one who takes the stand that Hosea here is referring, or God is referring to a woman with an inclination toward this. He says, Israel's waywardness and infidelity constitute a national, if you will, prostitution. Gomer, as a citizen of that thoroughly wayward nation, is described, just as many Israelite women could be, as a person of harlotry, precisely because she is a typical Israelite in that day and time. And this is an indictment in itself. God has commanded Hosea to marry a woman who, by reason of being involved in the endemic Israelite national unfaithfulness, is prostituting, if you will. To marry any Israelite woman was to marry a prostituting woman, so rife was the religious promiscuity of Hosea's day. So he takes it in the sense that, when God says, go take a wife of harlotry, have children of harlotry, it's just the idea that Israel, the northern kingdom, had become so involved in this prostitution that, it worked its way into, that was the inclination of nearly everyone at the time. This interpretation does help us understand another phrase in this same verse, this idea of children of harlotry. We need to ask the question, when God says, go take a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, were the children born to Hosea and Gomer harlots? No. I mean, anyone would answer that no. Hosea's children of harlotry were so called because, like their mother, they would become part of a corrupt, faithless nation of Israel. The last part of the verse, I think, is key to interpreting the first part. Again, it says, let me just read the whole verse. When the Lord first spoke to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take for yourself a wife of harlotry, have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. It's this last part of the verse, I think, that's key toward interpreting the first part, what we're concerned with. Is Hosea a practicing harlot when Hosea married her or not? It's the harlotry of Israel, again, that's the major point in this whole book. We need to remember that. Israel is plainly said to be committing flagrant spiritual harlotry against God. He is simply calling the prophet here, if you will, to take a wife and have children in the midst of this horrible situation. God's going to use their family dynamics, and, for example, the names of their children, to make his main point about Israel. Let's keep that clear in our minds. We don't want to get lost in this discussion about Gomer and the kids and miss God's biggest point. Some, of course, in this discussion about, well, was Gomer practicing harlot or prostitute when Hosea took her as a wife? Some struggle with the idea that God would command his prophet to marry a prostitute, because prostitution, of course, is condemned under the old covenant in many places. For the priest, for sure. In Leviticus chapter 21, verse 9, it says, also the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by harlotry, she profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. And then in Deuteronomy 22, verse 21, speaking of a daughter in a father's house, it says, then they shall bring the girl to the doorway of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death, because she has committed an act of folly in Israel by playing the harlot in her father's house. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. So the old covenant speaks firmly against the practice of prostitution. And some say, well, why would God ask Hosea to take a practicing harlot as a wife? So that's a legitimate question. On the other hand, though, God does at times ask prophets to do difficult things. If you know your Bible well, you're aware of that fact. In fact, God asked the prophet Hosea to do something very, very difficult. In Isaiah 20, verse 2, it says, at that time the Lord spoke through Isaiah, the son of Amos, saying, go and loosen the sackcloth from your hips and take your shoes off your feet. And he did so, going naked and barefoot. Then in Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 9 through 13, notice part of what Ezekiel was called to do as a prophet of God. But as for you, take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, put them in one vessel and make them into bread for yourself, and you shall eat it according to the number of the days that you lie on your side, 390 days. Your food, which you shall eat, shall be 20 shekels a day by weight. You shall eat it from time to time. The water you drink shall be the sixth part of a hin by measure. You shall drink it from time to time. You shall eat it as a barley cake, having baked it in their sight over human dung. Then the Lord said, thus will the sons of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations where I will banish them. And of course, the idea there, cooking food over human dung, made it unclean, obviously. So, a very, very difficult, perhaps even contradictory thing to do as a prophet of God. So God isn't above asking his prophets to do something. So this idea, well, God wouldn't ask Hosea to marry a practicing prostitute may not be totally determinative, because at times God does that. Here's another point to consider as we're considering, well, was Gomer a practicing prostitute, or one that, like many in Israel, had leanings that way? Having Gomer become a harlot instead of being one as the marriage begins fits, if you will, the analogy here better. Right? Remember, God's making a point here through Hosea's family about Israel. And it's fair to ask the question, was Israel a harlot when God entered into covenant with her? I don't believe so. She became one as time went on. She became one. And once again, you have to be careful. Sometimes you can't press an analogy too far, but I think this is a valid point to consider. Notice what Hosea later says. God says about Hosea, or God says about Israel, rather, later in the book. In Hosea 2, verse 15, God says, then I will give her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a door of hope, and she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. And what seems to be implied there is that there was this time of innocence for Israel, and when God entered into covenant with her, but then as time went on, she became a spiritual harlot. Then in Hosea 9, verse 10, it says, God says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your forefathers as the earliest fruit on a fig tree in its first season. But they came to Baal Peor and devoted themselves to shame, and they became as detestable as that which they loved. So once again, you can see the progression. Yes, I believe it's fair to say that Israel was not a harlot when God entered into covenant with her, but she became one. So perhaps Gomer maybe had inclinations toward that, but yet and became one, fits the analogy better. We have places like Ezekiel or Exodus chapter 19, verse 6 says, this is at the very establishment of this marriage, if you will, between God and his old covenant people at the covenant at Sinai. It says, now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession from among the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Then in Deuteronomy 7, verse 6, it says, Moses says, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. So once again, the question of the day here about Gomer, was she a harlot when Hosea married her, or did she become one? I don't think the text definitively says one way or the other. In fact, I would affirm that the way it's stated, in contrast to the way a practicing harlot is referred to in Scripture, leads us to the idea that perhaps she wasn't and then became one as time went on. Bottom line, though, I don't think it affects the understanding of the book one way or the other. If you want to take the tack that Gomer was a prostitute and Hosea married her in that condition, that doesn't affect what God is ultimately trying to say here. Again, a lot of Bible scholars throughout time have taken that approach. So either way, I think it works. Let's look on into verse 3. Hosea 1:3 says, so he, or Hosea, went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. All right, it's not only Gomer, but the children born to this union that are going to have a message for the people of Israel here. Here it's specifically said that Gomer conceived and bore him a son. And if you go on and read, we won't get to it today in this lesson, but 2 other children are born, and it just says in those cases, Gomer bore a son or a daughter. And some Bible students make a big point of the fact that it doesn't say bore him or Hosea, these other children, and they affirm that, well, these later children were illegitimate children due to Gomer's way of harlotry. The Hebrew writers or scholars that I looked at says you can't press that language in the original to perhaps make the point they're trying to make there. The big point here, I think, in verse 3, when it says, so he, or Hosea, went and did what God told him to do. And that's to his credit. To his credit, Hosea does what the Lord tells him to do. Whoever Gomer was at this point, Hosea didn't hold back. There's no hint here of any reluctance or excuses that you see sometimes at the call of God from other prophets. Hosea just goes and does. Perhaps, again, this might give some weight to the idea that Gomer wasn't a currently practicing prostitute when they were married. You could see, at least it'd be easy for me for Hosea to say, wow, Lord, are you sure about this? So this may lend some idea to the fact that she became one rather than was one. So a son is born to this union. Verse 4, Hosea 1:4, and the Lord said to him, or Hosea, name him Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. This new child was linked by name to the prophetic message from God. The command is exactly the same as it would be in the case of the latter children, no compassion or not my people. We'll get to them in a further lesson. The names, of course, given to the children are message names, as are also born by the children of Isaiah and the Messiah himself in Isaiah 7:14, and numerous other entities. In Ezekiel 23, you've got a Aholah and a Aholabah, and those names meant certain things. We see that a lot in the Hebrew writings. This particular message name of this first son, Jezreel, is on the surface perhaps a bit ambiguous. It must have been therefore effective in conveying God's message in those days when Jezreel was growing up. That is, his name served as a constant reminder of God's message to Hosea, since routine questions from friends and acquaintances about the meaning of the child's somewhat ambiguous name would eventually lead to a hearing of the message of the judgment it implied. There are at least two possible references for Jezreel here. It is a word used in the Bible in other places. First of all, the name Jezreel was the name of a place, a valley, or a plain stretching between the Samaria highlands and the Galilee highlands, and the town itself. So it was the name of an area as well as a particular town. The town, of course, was near Mount Gilboa at the eastern edge of the highlands, near a particular valley which ultimately leads to the Jordan. The town, Jezreel, had been a second royal residence in addition to Samaria for the Omri dynasty of kings. You can read about that in 1 Kings 18, 1 Kings 21, and 2 Kings chapter 8. It was this particular town, Jezreel, that provided the relevant historical focus, if you will, in this case, I believe, hearkening back to Jehu's bloody massacre of Omri's dynasty in 2 Kings chapters 9 and 10. God at that time, of course, commanded Jehu to go in and take care of the sinning Omri dynasty, but there's some implications later on. Just as Jehu's actions at Jezreel eliminated the Omri dynasty, so now Yahweh or God will eliminate the Jehu dynasty. There will be another Jezreel, if you will, another massacre. And I think that's the important reference here to this first child's name. God is using it prophetically to speak of another massacre by his hand. This massacre, if you will, or this judgment will apply the bloodshed of Jezreel to the family of Jehu. Such a punishment announcement with its continuation in verse 5 reflects the covenant curses of war. Their introductory lessons, we talked about that. Captivity of the king and the death and destruction mentioned in Deuteronomy 20 or Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy in various places. The phrase in the verse 4 here, when it says, "It will not be long," sets an approximate time frame for the execution of this judgment sentence. The judgment sentence is here pronounced, but its execution will only take place according to God's timing. The Jehu dynasty, we know historically, collapsed with the death of Zechariah in 752 BC. The literal fulfillment then was indeed swift. Less than 40 years would be needed for the northern kingdom itself to come to an end. So that's the significance here in chapter 1, verse 4, in this first child's name. Name him Jezreel, because God says, I'm going to do some punishing myself of the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day, God says in verse 5, I will indeed, on that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Now we're talking about the valley, not the city itself. The Jezreel Valley, of course, was the site historically of the northern kingdom's loss of independence at the hands of the Assyrians. In 733 BC, Tiglath-Pileser's armies captured the valley in the Assyrian campaign launched to quell the rebellion in Syria-Palestine. This broad valley area was, by Hosea's day, already famous as a great historic battlefield, the scene of several decisive battles in Israel's past, this Jezreel Valley. You've got the Deborah and Barak's defeat of the Canaanites in Judges 4 and 5. You've got Gideon's defeat of the Midianites in Judges 6 through 8. You've got the Philistine defeat of Israel under Saul in 1 Samuel 29 through 31. The Egyptian defeat of Judah under Josiah in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 29 and 30. So this Jezreel Valley was, again, a site of several important military endeavors. The bow mentioned here in verse 5, when God says, on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. bow in the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, is often used as a metaphor of military strength. You can see it in Genesis 49, verse 24, 1 Samuel 2, 4, and several other places in scripture. And to break the bow is typical of conquest or takeover, treaty curse language, if you will, symbolic of total defeat. So we've set the stage here in these verses 2 through 5. We've talked about, Hosea's marriage to Gomer, and that's going to play into the rest of the story, this prophecy in the book of Hosea. And it's also involving the names of this children. And prophetically, we see here in the name of this first child, God is saying judgment is coming on the nation of Israel. Of course, that's Hosea's ultimate message for the people. Hope that makes some sense. Again, chew on that, and I would encourage you to study ahead. And Lord willing, next class period, we'll pick up in verse 6 and continue talking about the names of the children that come to this marriage between Hosea and Gomer. We'll consider that at that time. God bless.